This is lecture 2 in a series of lectures for political science, Principles of Political Science 101. I wanted to just pick up a little bit and expand on a few ideas that have already been discussed, building on that foundation. You have to look back at the whole rationale for forming a government in the first place. Fundamentally, it comes down to just a simple question. Government is about who gets what. People form societies because they believe they can get more. If they join forces, then if they don't, more success, more security, more peace. Add to that the fact that human beings, by nature, for most of us, we're social beings. That basically we need each other. If you take two people and put them in a room by themselves, it won't take very long before they begin to talk, before they begin to connect. Human beings are not solitary animals, and so, as it turns out, whether we like it or not, we need each other, and more than likely, we're going to go ahead and we're going to form organizations of some type to give us more. So, when we talk about political order, we're also talking about political decay. And so, the most important then political distinction among the countries that we're looking at, again, doesn't concern the form, but the degree of governance. And so in order to be able to do that, assess that, the differences between, say, democracies and dictatorships, what we'd look at are those particular points we spoke about in Lecture 1. We would examine both those societies in terms of consensus, community, legitimacy, organization, effectiveness, and stability. This is how we can separate one country from another by doing an analysis on this level. Okay, so the United States, say Britain, they all have strong, adaptable, coherent political institutions, right? They have effective bureaucracies. They have well-organized political parties. They have a high degree of popular participation in public affairs. And they have working systems of civilians that control the military. Extensive activity by the government in the economy, and reasonably effective procedures for regulating succession and controlling political conflict. I'm always reminded of Jesse Jackson's comment when running for the presidency, or seeking his party's nomination for the presidency, the Democratic Party's nomination. He was asked, as were others, to say something nice about the Republicans. And when Jackson's turn came, he said, well, they'll leave office peacefully. That's a very important thing. It's the story of Jimmy Carter, for example, who, when he lost his re-election bid, went to the inauguration and then was basically flown back to Plains, Georgia, to the local high school. He lived in Plains, Georgia, got out of the helicopter and walked home. This is a very important, the changing of the guard. Doing that peacefully, having an acceptance around that. You'll see later on that the more effective we are at doing that, the more stable the society is, the more stable the government is. So all of these things, if they're in place, they allow for the citizens to have some measure of loyalty, right, to the government. And that's important because in order for the government to do what it needs to do, to give people more, it has to have that loyalty from the citizens, the faith of the citizens. So, taxing resources doesn't happen without that sense of loyalty. Conscripting manpower for armed conflict doesn't happen without that sense of loyalty. Innovation and the ability to execute policy to resolve issues can't be done without the loyalty. So, for Huntington, this rapid social change and the rapid mobilization of new groups, these social forces we talked about, having them come into the politics and coupled with the slow development of these political institutions, we discussed in the last lecture, causes violence and political instability. On the one hand, social forces, political institutions, and that's the road we're going to walk down. We're going to examine what happens with those, what needs to happen in order for this to be an effective and working nation. So when you look at this process of modernization again, We talked before about how England and the United States had a very long and happy, movement forward in their history. England had 183 years. The United States 89 years, 78 years for several other countries. As I said before, the actual movement forward now becomes more difficult for underdeveloped nations because they have less time to modernize, which means, as I said in the last lecture, the social bends sort of take place. And this becomes, obviously, a greater stress on the political institutions and greater levels of frustration for the social forces. All right, so creating order and not liberty is the problem. Let me explain. Liberty is a factor necessary for the social forces to be able to express what they need, they want. But ultimately, you need political institutions in order to make those wants, desires on the part of the social forces to actually come to fruition. So if you don't have, order, you can't possibly have liberty. Why is that? Well, liberty depends upon some sort of regulating body. If we all did whatever we wanted to do, whenever we wanted to do it, we wouldn't have a structured government, and we wouldn't have access to more stability and the like. We would have really a nation at war with itself. So creating order is what's really important. So what we're trying to understand is, how do you create this order, right? How do you structure this? So the players here, the major players are social forces. These are ethnic, religious, territorial, economic status groups. Any group that binds themselves together based on some belief, some understanding, some goal, these are going to create your social forces. And so modernization then, moving down that road, depends upon a multiplication and a diversification of those social forces. In other words, you need more social forces. As I mentioned previously, the more the social forces, the more balance you have. You're likely to have many members of one social force, say a religion, also part of other social forces, like the business community, homeowners, and the like. The more there's overlapping, the more diverse they are, these social forces, the more stable they become. And the reasoning is pretty simple. Let's say that I am part of a religious group, and we want X. But I'm also part of this homeowners association, and we want Y. Let's say they're located in the same place, relatively close to each other. And let's say the religious organization I belong to, they want, more parking in the surrounding areas so that basically their members could come and worship. Now, as a member of the homeowners association, that's going to impact where I live. It'll make it more congested and more difficult for me to enjoy my private life outside of my religious affiliation. So now I'm in conflict. On the one hand, as a member of this religious organization, I want there to be more parking available. But as a homeowner, I don't want that parking to affect the quality of life of myself and my neighbors. So I represent the two groups that have opposing and conflicting wants. Two social forces that have come and interacted with each other, looking for some sort of political solution. So my voice is going to be moderated by because I understand the needs of both. And so out of that, the overlapping of these groups will come any number of people, all of whom will want some sort of decision and some sort of resolution that minimizes the damage done to each of those groups. That becomes very stable. And that's what we're talking about. Political organizations, right, and their procedures, they resolve these disputes, right? They promote that sense of community. And so the more we have of that, the better off we're going to be. If we have, for example, let's take in a dictatorship, we have just two major social forces, right? The dictator and their entourage, if you will, and the public that basically try and steer clear of that first group. So right there, you're not going to have any moderate voices. It's a winner-take-all proposition. The dictator rules everything, or the people have to overthrow that dictator in order to have a say. So here, again, what we're trying to do with this process of modernization, if you think about that dictatorship example, we're trying to change the sheer force or the might of the dictator and the dictator's forces, right, into right. We want to make it so that what they do is consistent with what the people want, at least to a degree. So if you can't do that, then you can't succeed, right? So if there's nothing but conflict, you can't possibly have institutionalization. You can't possibly have a functioning political structure. Keep in mind that the political community itself, for those people that are part of that, that community is based upon the strength and the scope of the political institutions. So take America, for example. The country is only as stable as its multi-level institutions are stable. That means if you think about a conflict with people, say, of New York, they have a New York government that represents them in the national political structure. So they have a voice through their state government, the people, and also with the national government. So political community then is based upon having those particular political institutions in place. So we need social forces because we need to know what the public wants. If we're coming together to form a nation, we're doing that presumably for some purpose. We've already discussed that. And so the people and their voices have to be heard. And that means someone has to hear them. And that's political institutions. So the relationship between social forces and political institutions, that relationship is the driving force moving a nation towards modernization. Remember I talked about on the left-hand side, there's the beginning of a line, a traditional society. And on the right-hand end of that line, there's a modernized society. What moves a nation down that road is the relationship between the social forces and the political institutions. So it's very important that those political institutions, that they have certain characteristics. Obviously, all of these go a long way towards allowing those political institutions to remain viable and productive. So we want an institution, a political institution, to be as institutionalized as possible. My example before about Jimmy Carter and the presidency, think about how stable that is. We changed power at the top, and there was no revolution, there was no blood in the streets, there was a ceremony, and the previous leader went home when all was done. Abided by the election results and had no problem accepting them. So when we're looking at institutions, we're really looking at the level of institutionalization that exists there. On the social forces, we care about multiplication, right, and diversity, right? That balances those out. What balances out and gives strength to the political institutions is how institutionalized they are. And there's 4 ways that we have of measuring that, if you will. The first is we look at adaptability. Are they adaptable, or are the institutions very rigid? Right? The more adaptable, then the more institutionalized they're going to be. What do I mean by that? Think about the presidency example again. Here, regardless of what goes on, the presidency is pretty adaptable. we can measure that by how many times it's changed hands without conflict, right? We've had a succession of presidents from George Washington moving forward, and there's not been one single instance where the new president, the president-elect, right, has found and received resistance from the sitting president and said, you're not taking office. I'm stopping you. I've got the military. We're going to work that against you. And even though the people have voted for you, you're not taking office. So the more times we can do that, the more times we can change over authority like that, obviously that's an indication of a great deal of adaptability and a great deal of institutionalization. You've heard the expression, it's not the person, it's the office. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Another measure is complexity. If an institution is very simple, then it really can't sustain itself against the forces of time. That means if it's simple, as problems become more complex, that institution cannot handle them. So there is a complexity issue here. We want our institutions to be complex, multi-leveled, right, with different departments or sub-organizations dealing with different problems. Now, I understand this can go crazy. It can go out of hand. In America, we always complain that everything, there's a bureaucracy for everything, and sometimes that bureaucracy gets in the way. But the alternative is to have a completely weak bureaucracy or institutions that can't handle any of the social forces, any demands or pressures the social forces might put on them. This is not a good thing. This means that that society is very susceptible to rattling apart. Another way in which we measure how institutionalized a particular political institution is, we look at its autonomy. You can't really be institutionalized if you cannot act, the organization can act independent of other organizations. Here it's probably best to think about a dictator. A dictator, will have a structure, but that structure has to adhere to whatever the dictator wants at any given moment. So while there may be a department of whatever, that department might make decisions, but the dictator can come in as a single person and say, no, we're not doing that. There's no autonomy, which means that solutions to problems tend to come from a very limited number of people. And quite honestly, you can't come up with creative solutions just from a few people. You need that interplay. As we talked about with the social forces, you need that ability to act and have the authority to act on your own as part of a much larger structure of institutions. So we look for that. The more autonomy, the better. The more stable those institutions are going to be. The more specialized they're going to be. Finally, the last sort of level of institutionalization we're really interested in is coherence. Coherence of those organizations and their procedures. If an organization comes out with contradicting or inconsistent policies that are not consistent, then how do we know what is expected of us? Here, think of the Supreme Court, or any court for that matter, but especially the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what the law is, in large measure. And so if they decide cases in a haphazard or inconsistent way, we all don't know what the law is. We don't know how to behave. We don't know when we're running afoul of the law. We don't know when we're consistent with the law. We don't know the nuances of that law, tax code, for example. So the Supreme Court has to be coherent. They have to decide cases in a consistent way. Now, to show you the influence of social forces on an institution like the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, over time, will change its point of view. It will look at things that are well settled and say, we've sort of changed the way we view this over time, and this no longer stands. So an example of this would be the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court decided for blacks and whites, separate but equal was fine. Separate facilities for everything, a black bathroom, a white bathroom, so on and so forth. that was okay because blacks still got what the whites got. And then fast forward to Brown versus the Board of Education, and the court says, wait a minute, separate is inherently not equal. Because if you have to go to that bathroom as opposed to either bathroom, then that's an indication that somehow you're not equal. So the court in Brown v. Board of Education said, we know we've been saying separate but equal is fine, but the social forces over time and the way the society has changed and the way our thinking has evolved said that standard that we used, that was very consistent and coherent, no longer works. And so the Supreme Court changes direction. Another case sets precedent. And then we move forward with the idea, the rule of thumb of that case, we move out. And we continue to make decisions based on that case. That doesn't mean the Supreme Court decides it and it's done. What it does mean is that all the other political institutions, from the police on up to governors and mayors and the president, they have to act consistently with that. And if they don't, that creates a problem. So, for example, when the Supreme Court, after Board, Brown, decided that there needed to be integration in the schools, many Southern governors didn't want that. Many Southerners didn't want that. And so they resisted it. And every time they came before the court of Congress, their argument was, this is a very complicated issue. And we need to take a lot of time here to figure out how we're going to manage this. And it went on for a while. And then eventually, a couple of presidents had to speak to those governors and basically say, you're going to do this. You're going to integrate because that's the court's decision. And we're going to execute it. That's what we do as executives. We're going to execute it. And if that means we have to send in the National Guard to take over your state, Governor, that's what we'll do. Power there is diverse, and it's coherent, and it acts in accordance with and consistent with another important part of the bureaucracy that keeps the nation stable. Now, the southern states that resisted this may not have liked it, but it was more important to the stability of the society as a whole and to the very foundation, our principles, that's how we moved forward. So basically, the criteria of political institutionalization then is that there should be a political community in a complex society. Right? We need a political community in a complex society. That doesn't mean everyone's political, but it means there is a community of political participants who are involved in the governing of the nation. And then, of course, it comes down to the procedures that the society puts in place that have to be consistent, coherent, right? We need support, by the people, the social forces, for the organization and the procedures that they come up with. So the social forces and political institutions are doing the following dance. Social forces are involved every day with the everyday living. Problems arise. They decide how they like those problems resolved. Not everybody agrees about how they should be resolved. So there's a conflict. This is where the political institutions come in, and they come up with a rationale for resolving the conflict as best they can, and then having institutions in place that can affect those ends. So political institutions, then, are critical to the process. It's the opposite side of the coin. While you may have social forces on one side, you absolutely have to have political institutions on the other. So another measure of adaptability here, or another way to put this, is that we can measure adaptability by chronological age. And I alluded to this before with the presidency changing hands. So if some institution has been around for a long time, it's more institutionalized, it's more stable. If it's undergone generational changes, in our case it's the president leaving office and a new president coming in, same with a governor or a mayor or a congressperson, the more people that come in and can leave, and the structure still stays in place, right? It's not a cult of personality where if one person leaves, the whole thing falls down. If you have a lot of power changing hands, that means that it's very adaptable, and that adaptability is important to keeping the political institutions thriving to meet those the demands of those social forces. Last adaptability is the functional aspect here. How do they function, right? Has it transformed itself? The organization itself triumphs over its function, right? Basically, it matures, right? It becomes on-set in its ways. It becomes flexible. So you can function in many different ways. This ability to adapt leads to, more complex institutions, and that's good. It leads to more autonomy, as we said, which is good. It leads to more coherence, which is also good. So we're looking for political institutions which are very complex. So, as social forces that are diversified and multiply in nature. So now look at that road to modernization again. On your far left, you've got these traditional societies, and on your far right, you've got these, modern societies. So as you're, I guess on your end, it might be right to left, but it doesn't much matter. On one end is traditional, on the other is modernized. Now here's the odd thing. When it's a traditional society, it's very stable. When it's a modern society, it arrives at modernity, it's very stable. So I said in the last lecture that if you divide that line into quadrants, you get that first quadrant and the last one that really are not so problematic. They're transitions. They're the beginning of those transitions. But it's that second and third quarter that is the most unstable, because that's where the transitions are becoming more and more intense, and there's a battle between the development of these political institutions, moving from, say, just a king to more complex institutions, and where social forces are beginning to multiply and diversify, and there's conflict. Now, you've heard me talk about the societal bends. What I mean here is that this road to modernization, as a nation moves down it, there's a need to speed up, to change the way they've done things, to develop these institutions, right? To get the social forces activated, diversified, and multiplied. But the problem here, of course, is that the faster that happens, the more uncomfortable a section of that society or certain social forces becomes, because it's too much for them. It's akin to growing older and really not caring about the new technology, where it's like, well, things are changing kind of fast. I don't care about that. I'm not going to be involved in that. You disconnect from it. And really, you want to go back to the good old days. Now, as things become more complex, that begins to happen a lot quicker. Think about where you are now, and think about perhaps younger siblings or younger cousins, younger family members. Those 9-year-olds are accepting the new technologies and the new structures without question, and they're using them. You're already getting to the point, when you're in your college years, where you're not as interested in learning every little thing that comes out. And in fact, you might be turning to your 9-year-old sibling and saying, what are you doing with that? How does that work? At some point, you'll be 40, 50, 60, and your interest in the new ways will become greatly reduced for a host of reasons that go beyond the scope of the class. So the longer you have to move forward, the more stable those institutions are, and the more stable the social forces are as they develop. And as I said before, the longer the period of time you have to do that, or if you're the first to do it, as was the case with England, the more likely you are to keep stability in the process. When you think about how fast it has to be today, as we try and impose democracy, right? It doesn't work because you can't move people so quickly. You can't change their whole frame of reference. You can't tell people who fear the dictator that the dictator's now over. And now there's going to be these new structures in place, and you guys should all let these new structures know what you think. Whereas before, if you let the dictator know what you think, you might find yourself, in a grave situation. So now you're asking people who have grown up under one structure to forget that structure. Don't carry forward the same concerns. This is a brand new day. It doesn't work. So how do we know that a nation then is beginning to modernize? How do we get a sense that they're beginning to move forward? Well, we look for certain things. We call these the principal aspects of modernization, or at least Huntington does. Here, we're looking for a greater level of urbanization. If you don't have more people in cities or moving to cities, the chances are you're not modernizing as well as you might. Why is that? Well, as people form cities, they do so because it allows them to get more of what they want. They don't need to have a subsistence life where they're on the farm growing their own food, fighting the elements. They're in the city, and in the city, there's no need to grow one's own food, to spend your time doing that. You can trade, money you've earned for the goods and services you need. Another is industry. We need industrialization. We need to move off of individual endeavors, again, like the farm or the local general store, and we need to have industry develop. Why? They can employ more people, and they can give people a very different life experience. Rather than getting up the crack of the dawn and tending to the fields and the animals, now you've got a very different structure you're working in. And of course the young want that, right? The one certainty about the young is that whatever the generation before them wanted, they don't want that. They want to specify or cut out their own new language, new ways of expressing things. It's not really very new. Every generation does it. They come up with their own way of speaking to each other because it makes them feel different than the generation before them. You also need, as a principal aspect, secularization. You have to change from a more religiously driven society to a civil society. Now, why is this? Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that there should be no faith or there should be no religion. But what I am saying is, in the United States, you need to separate them. You need to separate religion from governance. Why is that? And by the way, again, I'm not saying that whatever the moral, underpinnings are of religion should be ignored in government. But the religious organization itself should not be running the government. In large measure because religion, they have a very set way of viewing the world. And you can't contradict that set way, or there's going to be a great deal of conflict. If you look at the conflicts around the world today, a great many of them are based on religious beliefs where the religion is trying to run the government. This is a relationship that has to work itself out, which comes with tolerance and the like. Now think about that urbanization example again. When you get people of many different faiths in one place, they really have to work out their issues. Otherwise, they end in a great deal of conflict, which has a very destabilizing effect on the society. So when you're in the same city together, rather than in an isolated community, you have to adapt. Think about foreigners coming here and becoming American citizens. That first generation wants to live around people like them, that speak their language, that eat their foods, that have the same culture. I understand that, and so should you, right? It's comforting. It feels like home. But the next generation, their children, are sort of a transitional generation. They're not quite as committed to the old ways as, say, their parents and grandparents, but they still respect them, embrace them, and they still strongly identify with them. The third generation really begins to break away. They see the mix of cultures, they take what's best from each, and they begin moving towards that to the great sort of dissatisfaction of their parents and their grandparents. And then by the fourth generation, you have things like intermarrying between cultures, between races. People are beginning to really move out and move away from the original culture that existed here in America. That's why you'll see neighborhoods in America that used to be predominantly one group. They have now become predominantly another group. You can follow waves of immigrants and see that develop in cities. But cities create a situation where there's a bombardment of other types of cultures. And that urban right, setting helps rattle loose the old ways, which of course the grandparents and the parents have great difficulty understanding. One of the great problems in America is if a particular culture holds on to their culture and expands their culture and does not really integrate. That's the beginning of setting up conflict, and or separates themselves from, or believes they're more special than others. This is the beginning of conflict, because now you're setting aside your group, and that group refuses to integrate, setting itself apart, which means it's not part of the multiplication of social forces in the way it should be, and it leads to alienation and conflict. So secularization is really very important. Next is, as a principal aspect, is democratization. You have to democratize. If you get this far down the road, and you've got all this other stuff in place, urbanization, industrialization, secularization, you've got the multiplication and diversification of social forces, you've got the political institutions institutionalizing, but you don't have democracy. It doesn't make much sense, because democracy is a type of government structure that allows the social forces to express themselves and limits, through some founding document, in our country it's the Constitution, from acting in a way that's inconsistent with the general public desires or needs. So democracy is the place you really want to end up. Now, it has its failings. Democracy is by no means the best system. It's probably the best of the worst systems. And what I mean by that is that democracy isn't a cure-all. It's a beginning. It's a part of a process. If democracy were a cure-all, we wouldn't have the great disparity in classes, economic well-being in the United States. There are other countries that have a much more aligned, much closer associated class structure. In America, we don't really, if you look at the rich and the poor, we're pretty far apart. In other words, you don't see a lot of gradation there. More and more, it's the haves are the haves and the have-nots are the have-nots. We don't like to think of that in terms of class warfare, but ultimately it's economic warfare. The haves and the have-nots. It's always that. It's always been that throughout history. If you're going to be a dictator, you're going to have. And if you're not the dictator, you're not going to have. And this is a great source of conflict, which has to be resolved. And in a dictatorship, for example, the only way to resolve that is for the dictator to move towards more of a democratic rule, much as you have in China. They're beginning to realize in the last couple of decades that to sustain themselves and survive and to prosper, as the world gets closer and closer and more interrelated because of technology and the like, they've moved more towards democracy, slowly, carefully, in certain sectors and not in others completely. And it certainly has its issues and its problems. Another principal aspect that we're looking for is education, levels of education. Now, why is that important? Because the more educated an individual is, the more they're exposed to different ideas, different cultures, different problems, various attempts to resolve those problems, they become sophisticated consumers of political information. And that means they're not tied to the old ways or a religious imperative. This is wrong, that's right. That the education brings with it a broader understanding of the world and our place in it, which is a great stabilizing mechanism because you can understand the other guy's point of view. You can understand, what it is that's troubling. And you can begin to find a way to resolve that peacefully. Remember, you can't have more of what you want, which is why we form governments, more security and the like, if there's turmoil. You need peace in order to move forward. If there is not peace, you can't move forward. You can't modernize, right? You can't have a society that's more capable of giving you what you need and want. If there's conflict, these things don't prosper. Conflict is not rich soil for the kinds of things that the government needs to give us. And education really helps us move along, towards integrating in that way. Finally, another principal aspect of modernization is media participation. People have to know what's going on, have to understand information, and be able to process that information. That's why education is important. And you need to be able to have more people participating in the collection and dissemination of information. Now, it's odd because what we've learned in the last couple of decades is that the more we have access to that information, the more we can spread it, the more it moves around. A couple of interesting things happen. One, it becomes less reliable. That is to say, different points of view, not really based on fact, get out there. And it's very hard for the average consumer of information to really fully determine what is the reality. I'm not saying the truth, but what is the reality? And if you can't do that, then having all this information is of very little use. So there's a mix of information. Everyone's got a point of view, and it's difficult to integrate it. So it becomes more frustrating, and that's not good. The other thing about having so much information is that it can bury you. There's so much to know. There are so many intricacies that you can't become an expert in them. Even with high degrees of education, there are some areas that are just too complex. It would just take too much of your time to really understand them. When a nation has, 72,000 pages of tax code, which is about what the U.S. has, it's very difficult to become an expert in the tax code. And it's changing all the time. So oddly enough, the access to information and the expansion of information actually makes it harder to really participate in the process of understanding what that information means. And so it's interesting that when we look at the information that we're given, the very thing we're striving for, which is more of it and greater participation in it, actually to an extreme has begun to work against us, because the importance of having the information is to be able to make reasonable and rational decisions which support peace, which support a very productive move forward. So it's very important to have those aspects, right? And so those aspects are going to have, those principal aspects are going to have an impact on many different levels in which we all function. And that's what we're going to discuss in the next lecture.